All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dana Render, and I am the Director of Education with Trees Atlanta. And thank you tonight for coming to our Ask the Expert with Evan Mallen on local climate change. So this is designed to be a little bit more interactive from some of our other webinar series that we've had, and will allow you to actually vocalize your questions. So if you have been in any of our classes or you volunteered with us, you'll know that Trees Atlanta's mission is really to protect and improve Atlanta's urban canopy. And we do that through planting and conservation efforts and educating. Right now, you're in one of our education classes. And we also plant trees, which is what most people know us for. We also do biodiversity encouragement in our environment by removing invasive species and replanting with natives. So we'd like to welcome you to this webinar today, and it is going to be interactive. Because it won't be a traditional webinar where you're listening to a full presentation and then we'll take questions at the end. If you do have a question, we ask that you raise your hand. You can find the raise your hand tool that should be in the chat feature by your name. And you can raise your hand if you have questions, and we highly encourage you to ask questions today. We'll also be going through any questions that were submitted ahead of time to be addressed during the webinar. So we really want to make sure that we're offering content that serves your needs. So we will be sending out an email with a feedback survey, and we just invite you to let us know how you like this particular format, how you like this class. And also if there are any other topics that you'd really like to learn about. These are just a couple of upcoming classes that we have with a Grow and Learn. That is typically with our employees that work at our Browns Mill Food Forest. And we have that coming up on tomorrow, actually, at 9 o'clock. It will be about bees. So we have Jimmy Gant coming to talk about bees, and we'll also talk about pollinators in the garden. And we have another speaker series coming up on September 3rd, which is about Atlanta's secrets of trails and trees. You can find registration for all of these at treesatlanta.org/calendar. You can also sign up for other events or find us on social. So tonight we'll have Evan Mallen. He is a researcher at Georgia Tech, and he works in the Urban Climate Lab, and he is a postdoc fellow at the Center for Teaching and Learning. So I'm going to go ahead and send this over to him. Evan, you're welcome to get started.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Let me just share my screen now. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am certainly honored to be here with all of you tonight on a beautiful Friday evening. Thank you for spending that with me. Learn about climate change. So as Dana said, my name is Evan Mallen. I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Teaching and Learning at Georgia Tech, but I'm also a researcher in the Urban Climate Lab, where I have been researching climate change, specifically local climate change, urban heat islands and the like for the last many years. So I just wanted to cover a little bit first in a very brief, I hope very brief presentation that can cover some of the basics of what we're up against here in Atlanta and in the United States and in the world when it comes to a changing climate. So I just want to cover some of these and then open it up to some questions, but please do feel free to ask any questions along the way. I do want this to be a conversation with all of you. So please do ask away, and we can stop and talk at any time. All right. So climate change has been quite a hot topic in the last couple of years, pun entirely intended. We have seen record-breaking temperatures even in the Arctic. In Alaska, we have had Anchorage hitting all-time high of 90 degrees. We've had a town in Siberia reach its very first 100-degree Fahrenheit day, the hottest that they have ever recorded. Paris, France, suffered a 113-degree heat wave That was one of the hottest that the city has ever seen. You may remember that Australia, much of the country simultaneously, was on fire. This was due to record droughts and record high temperatures, together feeding major wildfires that spread all across the entire country. We have a climate that is changing faster than our infrastructure will allow. You may notice something is very odd about this parking gate. We have infrastructure that is literally melting because it was not designed to withstand the heat regimes that we have in our cities. We have crosswalks that melt in India. We have railroads that buckle. We have highways that buckle. You may remember from your high school physics class that when things get hot, they expand. And if they have nowhere to expand, they will buckle and break. We have runways that are melting, that aircraft can no longer take off from or land on because they will sink into it. We have a climate that's changing faster than our culture will allow. This is the British Imperial Guards, one of whom has fainted due to heat exhaustion, because this is not clothing that is necessarily weather appropriate for the summers that England is starting to experience. This is the 2015 US Open. This is a tennis player who has succumbed to heat exhaustion himself. Of course, we have, in extreme cases, heat exhaustion turns into heat-related mortality. This is after the Chicago heat wave, the historic Chicago heat wave. This is 40 unmarked bodies who succumbed to heat in the Chicago heat wave. So we have major, major issues with heat. It is a very, very serious health issue, and we are experiencing it already. In fact, heat is the leading cause of weather-related mortality. It kills more people than any other weather-related disaster combined. It does not get the same amount of attention as things like tornadoes and hurricanes. They're not quite as drastic, but it is much, much more dangerous. So just to give a little bit of an overview of what we're up against, don't let anybody tell you that we are not experiencing climate change. We have been seeing it happen since the mid to late 1800s. We don't even need to look at climate projections to know that it is happening. We have been measuring it for a very long time. We can point to our observed warming of up to 8 degrees on average in this country since the 1960s, or the 1901 to 1960 baseline average. We've seen quite a bit of warming. Most of this, you may notice, is actually in the north, where we need it the least. And so that is causing major, major changes in those local climates. We are seeing a little bit less warming here, but that changes quite a bit when we start looking at projections for what we're going to face by the end of the century. This is really relevant to Trees Atlanta. One of the ways that we can track a changing climate is by tracking the hardiness zones. So what kinds of plants can grow and where and when. And we have witnessed these climate zones shift. They are migrating. They are shifting to the north as we are warming up. So to summarize that, you can see the shifts from one zone to another. And this means that we are actually able to plant fewer trees than we were previously able to plant. This was from a study from a couple of years ago now, where 2020 was the future, but we're here now. We're actually, in 2020, these are trees, native tree species that are actually no longer appropriate to our local region to plant because of the climate that we have already become and will continue to become. These are species of tree that will not survive very well in the climate that we've become and the climate that we will have. So when we look into the projections, you can see that we've already warmed about 8 degrees in some areas of the country, and we will warm by about another 8 in the higher emission scenario by the end of the century. So we're looking at some very, very hot temperatures. In fact, this is a concept called a climate analog. This is what our summers will look like by the end of the century. And according to Climate Central, our summers by 2100 in Atlanta will start to look more like far Texas. And I am wondering if the tool was not able to go any further south than that. And we may actually be looking at an even warmer climate than that by the time we actually reach the end of the century. When we turn to precipitation, this one is a bit different because it is not necessarily projected to change in any single direction. We are not necessarily looking at significantly more or significantly less overall precipitation. In our region, we're looking at a little bit more drought condition. But what is important is how that rain falls. And so what we're actually seeing, or what we project to see by the end of the century is overall perhaps an increase in precipitation, but more so it's interesting in how it falls. They're going to fall in fewer but more intense rainfall events. So we're going to have longer periods of drought broken up by very, very heavy rain. Rain that is will very easily overwhelm our stormwater systems. So we've actually been seeing this quite a bit in the last few years in the Southeast. So whenever it does rain, you probably saw this just in the last couple of weeks. It rains extraordinarily hard. They can come out of nowhere. There can be very long periods of drought between them. They will fall very, very heavily for a very short period of time. And so an interesting way to think about how we plan for climate change is looking at our what's called coping capacity. So imagine that this bouncing line here is precipitation. So if it's within certain bounds for what we are ready for, then it's not really a problem. But as soon as it goes above, that is an intense flood, that is a very, very heavy precipitation event, over a very short amount of time, that becomes a major problem. We start getting a lot of floods. The same thing on the other end, where if we go below a certain threshold, we are very vulnerable because of the drought conditions. We might run out of water. We might have some conditions where we actually need to be rationing our water usage, which we've seen already here. And so what we need to do is build our coping capacity or our coping range by adapting, by building out our capacity through various planning means, which I hope to talk to you a whole lot more about tonight. And that is how we survive climate change, by building that capacity. And we have to build it on either end to be prepared for more extreme in both directions. And that is a term that we call resilience. So when we dig down into local climate change, that's kind of the more broad, what are we up against in terms of climate change? But let's look locally. So what do I mean when I talk about local climate change? Well, the first driver of local climate change is actually still the global climate change. So what happens to the world, so that happens to our cities as well. And that's coming from our greenhouse gas emissions. So this is another way to visualize what I showed you earlier. We have been seeing a warming climate for a very long time, since basically the Industrial Revolution, since we decided to start burning a lot of coal and oil. That has produced excess greenhouse gas, and that has created what we call a runaway greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect we actually like. The greenhouse effect is the reason why we can live on this planet. The moon, for example, does not have a greenhouse effect, and last I checked, there's not that many people living on the moon. So the reason that we can live on this planet is because the atmosphere can trap outgoing long-wave radiation that comes from the surface of the planet. When you are wearing a blanket, what is warming you? Why do you feel all warm and cozy? You are warming you. It is your own heat that is being trapped by the blanket, and that keeps you warm. It makes you all the warmer. That is the greenhouse effect. So we have incoming solar radiation. This is shortwave solar radiation. It gets absorbed by the Earth's surface and re-emitted as long-wave radiation, as a lower intensity energy. And that is what gets trapped in the greenhouse gases. That is what bounces back and forth between the surface and the atmosphere. So this is something we actually like. Now the challenge is when we have too many greenhouse gas emissions that makes our blanket thicker. And we heat up because more of this is getting trapped and bounces right back down. So keep this in mind. The greenhouse gases are one part of the equation. The outgoing long wave radiation is the other part of that equation. Keep that in mind. This is what we talk most about. When we talk about dealing with climate change, we talk about dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And where has that gotten us so far? Hasn't gotten us very far. It is very slow. This is my favorite piece of public art. It is entitled Politicians Debate Global Warming by Isaac Cordell. So talking just about the greenhouse gases, you can really only do so much. There's a lot that we can do, and we should talk about it tonight. But there's only so much you can do at the local municipal level. Where we are here in Atlanta, what we're looking at is mostly climate change that is driven by these 4 other drivers: loss of vegetation, impervious materials, waste heat, and urban morphology. So just to give you a brief primer on what these mean: loss of vegetation, we've seen this all over Atlanta. We are losing trees at an alarming rate, and it is mostly to do with development. Fun fact, the #1 reason why we are losing trees is single-family housing converting to single-family housing that is much larger and takes up more of the lot, sells for a higher price. The developer makes a lot of money, and we lose a lot of trees in the process, where we end up with a lot of those kind of big rectangular boxy homes that take up as much of the lot as they're allowed to take up. And we lose a lot of trees because they don't fit in the plan for the house. So we have a lot of loss of vegetation here. Just to show you what that means, vegetation soaks up moisture from the ground. It expels it through the evapotranspiration. As the tree grows, that water will come back out as vapor on its leaves. And that can really change the local climate. In Southwest Australia, there is a fence. And on one side, we see a lot of clouds. On the other side, we do not. There's a lot of vegetation on this side that is putting that moisture up into the air. Makes it much more livable climate. On the other side, there is not a lot of vegetation. That's because on this side of the fence are rabbits. They ate it all. They were an invasive species. They ate all the vegetation. We had to put up a fence. Not we, but Australia had to put up a fence to block them from getting to the rest of the country. And you can see just how much of an effect that can have by losing the vegetation on one side versus the other of that fence. Vegetation will cool us down up to 20 to 45 degrees on the surface by just shading. Shading alone will keep that surface much, much cooler. But also, like I mentioned, the evapotranspirative cooling. Trees sweat for us. So we sweat because the moisture will come out onto our skin. That evaporates, and that steals what's called latent heat. It captures that heat and blows away in the phase change from a liquid to a gas. So just by having trees around, even if you're not in the shade, you might feel 2 to 9 degrees cooler than an unvegetated space because that tree is sweating for you. You can see here just inside versus outside of a shadow, you can have that surface temperature be 94 degrees versus 142 degrees Fahrenheit. This shows you just how much of an effect that can have. Now you multiply this up to a whole city scale, and you can see why we get a lot of very warm surfaces in the city. And of course, Atlanta's right up there with some of our major declines in metropolitan tree canopy. We are losing trees at an alarming rate, and this is causing a major change in our local climate. The next one, impervious materials. When we tear down that vegetation, what do we replace it with? Usually streets, sidewalks, buildings, and parking lots. The building materials themselves will soak up a lot of that sun. That is the incoming shortwave radiation. It warms up, and there's more of that outgoing long-wave radiation as a result. Anyone who has walked on a blacktop barefoot in the middle of the day knows that that is a very bad idea because that blacktop is going to heat up significantly. You can see here just the same road that is different colors, this darker color that's going to soak up more of the sun coming in. We call that a low albedo. That is 138 degrees versus just this lighter area, 96 degrees. So that can make a major, major difference. Next, we have waste heat. This might be a familiar sight to some of you. This is Atlanta. If you put all of the Atlanta metropolitan region's commuting distances end to end, every day we would reach the sun. We are drivers. We drive quite a bit. We drive long distances and we do it routinely. And what comes out of that tailpipe? A lot of waste heat. And that waste heat can get trapped in the urban environment, and that can also lead to a warmer climate. Now, of course, when we come with warmer temperatures, of course, in our interior spaces, we want to cool that down. And so we turn our air conditioners on. By running all those air conditioners at once, there's two problems that happen. The first is that the waste heat from the air conditioner, that heat has to go somewhere, it ends up outside. You can make your entire neighborhood and your entire city a lot warmer just by running it at a high intensity to cool down your interior. The other problem that we have is that we might run into more electrical failures. So as the grid gets stressed, you run into a higher and higher chance of a blackout or a brownout, which means that actually nobody ends up with air conditioning in that event. So one of the things that we're doing in the Urban Climate Lab right now, this is hot new data. It is not published yet, so please don't share it widely, but we're starting to analyze interior temperatures. We're modeling the temperatures that you might find inside your home during a concurrent blackout and heat wave period. So before the blackout, we have actually very few homes that have this kind of extreme caution. This is a heat index. This is that kind of feels like temperature. The extreme caution is temperatures up to about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And so most of the city looks just fine. It actually is able to run its air conditioning. It is able to afford to use it. This is a major social justice issue in that some of these areas are not actually able to run it even if they have it because it's so expensive. But what happens when we have a blackout? City turns into this. So we have significantly more of the city, in fact, almost all of it, that ends up in this caution or extreme caution range once we hit a blackout. This is a major problem physiologically for our bodies. Because we live in air conditioning all the time, our bodies think that we are living in Minnesota. And so when you have such a shock to your body, that is when we start running into major issues with heat-related morbidity and mortality. That gets people sick, and that makes people, unfortunately, sometimes die if it's intense enough. And so that abrupt of a shift is an extraordinarily dangerous thing. And so this is why we need to also have a resilient grid in addition to a resilient green infrastructure going on in this city that can help protect us from such an event. Finally, we have urban morphology. That is the size and shape of your city. So if you have incoming solar radiation, it hits the side of your buildings. We call this an urban canyon. That's just going to start bouncing around back and forth. What do you have going on between that? You have a lot of roads. You have a lot of waste heat going on. That all gets trapped right here in that canyon, and that can really help elevate that temperature. And we have more and more and more of the city and more of the world looking exactly like this. We have more and more of these canyons that are going to trap that heat. And so we have more and more of that potential to be raising those temperatures and really affecting our local climate. So our good old friend, the greenhouse effect. Remember I said that there are two components to this. There is the greenhouse gas emissions, which we talk about all the time with climate change. But we also have that outgoing long wave radiation. All of those things that I just pointed to increase long wave radiation. So I argue to you, as I have before, that local climate change is climate change. There is no difference between the local climate change that we experience here and the global climate change that we've been talking about for decades. And in fact, as we make our local climate change all the worse, that is affecting the global climate at the same time. And so I am going to leave my little presentation there, but I've collected a whole lot of extra information that I just kind of compiled in here, but I want to talk to you. So if you have any questions for me, we can get going on that. And if you touch on something I do have some slides prepared for, I can use some of those as some visual cues. So, so I'm going to leave it there for now.
Okay.
Do you have any?
We do. I think what I'll do, Evan, is I'll break the ice. Someone submitted a question ahead of time, and so I'm going to go ahead and read that. And it is a multi-level question. It's got a couple of questions within this one. So It says, it seems like a lot of decisions are made at the zoning board level that impact our local climate for better or likely worse. For municipalities who want to be mindful of heat island impacts and who have a clause in their development ordinance that requires that a proposed development to be at least as protective of the environment as the current state, what is a practical list of environmental analysis you would like to see planning departments and zoning boards require to make climate-friendly design choices in places like stream buffers and urban forests? In other words, what metrics do decision makers need to measure climate impact of the changing landscape, and what studies should planning staff require to provide the zoning board? And P.S., do you offer trainings for municipal staff?
I do not offer formal trainings, but if anyone asks me, then I would be happy to oblige. I'll talk to anyone anytime. That is a doozy of a question, and it is a wonderful question because it touches a lot on the other side of this. So I talked a lot about the science. What is incredibly important for us to be looking into is the policy and design. And so I have a few policies here that I wanted to just touch on. So in terms of the metrics, how do we protect our climate from changing locally is really going to be touching on all four of those drivers of local climate change. So the types of measures that we should be looking out for are kind of similar to our tree protection ordinance that we already have. So our current tree protection ordinance says that we need to maintain the count and caliper of the trees. So if you cut down a really big tree, a very wide diameter, then you can't just plant a single tiny tree back. It needs to add up to the caliper of that tree. So you need to plant a bunch of smaller trees in order to add up. That greening makes a very big difference, but trees are not the only way for us to do that. Green roofs make a big difference, but we also can use things like cool roofs. That is just a white roof. You paint that roof white, or you use a type of covering that's called TPO. It's like a plastic kind of covering. And you can significantly reduce temperatures both locally around the building and within the building. So these are the kinds of things that we want to protect. That touches on the albedo of it. We also want to, if we can, try and reduce things like waste heat and control the urban morphology. Those are a lot tougher to do when it comes to things like zoning. So there is a wonderful policy that I would love to see in more places called green area ratio or green factor. And it is used in very few cities in the world. To my knowledge, the only city in the United States is Seattle that uses this policy. The other two that I'm aware of are Berlin and Malmo, Sweden. But this is my favorite feature. If y'all are familiar with design standards like LEED, where it's kind of a point system, you know, you get to LEED silver or LEED gold by building up the number of points for things that are broadly sustainable or environmentally friendly. This does that from the zoning scale. So it does it at that level. Based on your zoning class, you have a minimum score that you need to reach in order to get your permit approved for development or redevelopment of that land. And so you can see here that there's a wide variety of strategies that you can use. You can have things like just landscaped areas. You can have rain gardens. You can have small plants, small trees, medium trees, large tree, large existing trees. You get a lot of points for just retaining the trees that are already there. Because you then have built in that large tree canopy. You get both the shading and the higher evapotranspiration rate. And so not all of these are the same. They're actually scored based on their impact on the local climate. And so when you look into scoring, you'll see here things like small plants are not worth very many points. Small trees the same. But if you protect the large existing trees, well, suddenly you have a much, much higher green factor score. You have to preserve fewer existing trees to reach that minimum score than you would have to plant brand new trees to get there. And that might end up saving you a lot of money. You can have things like rain gardens and bioswales, stormwater planters. Those are worth a lot of points because this is locally climatologically sensitive. So what do we know about Seattle? It is great. It is rain all the time. And so they care quite a bit about those stormwater management benefits. So you get a lot of points by having that kind of stormwater protection built into your landscaping. And so one of the beautiful things about the green area ratio in Seattle is that this is a scoring system that works on a parcel by parcel basis. It is entirely up to the individual developer to decide how they want to reach that score, what kinds of strategies they're going to use, and whether they even want to do this, when they determine whether they want to purchase and redevelop some land. But we know from ecology that the only way that you can really get a meaningful, sustainable ecology is to have connectivity, is to have corridors, to have green corridors through the city. And so what they've done is they placed an overlay zoning district throughout the city that actually creates these green corridors throughout the city. And these are the overlay districts where you need to reach these minimum scores. Everywhere else, it's not enforced. So these are the areas that we know we need to have these green corridors, and so that is where they put them. And anyone who has been to Seattle recently or will go there soon, hopefully if it's safe to travel again, if you stand in an area that is beautiful, it's vegetated, it's very well landscaped, look around you, because you are very likely to see the adjacent parcels also have that kind of landscaping, because it was actually required of them to do so, because they're in the same corridor. And then that system therein makes a collective kind of decision to have these corridors based on the individual decisions of these developers, because of the requirement to build up to that certain amount. And we could do the very same in Atlanta. This it actually came, these conservation areas came from our emerging urban ecology framework. And you might notice that they are really disjointed. So we don't actually have too corridors corridors going on through the city. And so even if this were the thing that we were to stick to, this concept, it's going to be tough to get those kinds of same corridors. And so we do have a precedent for this kind of thing, and that is the Beltline Overlay District. So that is an overlay zoning district that says if you are part of the Beltline overlay district, then you're going to have certain extra requirements, things like landscaping. So we actually have a precedent to set that kind of thing here. And so I think that in Atlanta, we could absolutely have a new zoning overlay district, maybe as part of the urban ecology framework, that does require certain things that are related to those drivers of the urban heat island. So we could very easily actually have checks on what is the pre-development average vegetative cover, something like that, canopy cover. What is the pre-development stormwater runoff volume? This is something that we do now, kind of. We try and manage stormwater runoff by matching the pre and post development runoff values. But you can do that very well with impervious materials. We could bring in things like albedo. You could say, what is the average albedo of the pre and post development? If you are taking a building and you are renovating it, but you are going to put a white roof on it, based on our local climate, that makes a major difference. And so that is something that we could build into the zoning code to say you need to have a white roof. And in fact, there are cities out there in hot climates like ours that have done that. Los Angeles has a very strong white roof program. Citywide, you need to be putting white roofs on new developments or redevelopments. And that is going to see a major cooling effect. The city of Louisville has incentives now to utilize cool roofs and green roofs where possible, but cool roofs is what they're targeting right now. And that is something we could build into the zoning code. As I said, the waste heat and urban morphology, that's a lot more difficult to deal with. I do know that Portland, Oregon is working on this right now, urban morphology. They're actually exploding in growth right now. They're building new residential buildings at an incredible rate. And they are trying to manage what should the shape, orientation of these buildings really be in order for us to ensure that we don't have a runaway local climate change as a result of all the housing that we're building. So they're actually doing this in a very progressive way. We have, across the world, internationally, we have cities in China that are very well concerned with urban ventilation. And so they are actually working on studies and they are working on kind of municipal codes that will ensure that if you are, say, up against a large body of water where you get these kinds of, say, ocean breezes that might get into the city, they're actually making sure that that breeze can penetrate into the interior of the city based on the orientation of their buildings. And even doing some fun architectural things like having the first floor of every new building be entirely on pillars to open up that entire ground floor level so that that wind can blow straight through. Because the way that we build our cities now, if you have a beautiful oceanfront view, you're going to put large flat buildings right there to maximize the amount of real estate value. And that just completely blocks those incoming breezes that can help cool the city down. So we don't have such a large body of water like that in Atlanta, but we could still do everything we can to increase urban ventilation to make sure we can get the airflow through, to not stagnate the air and help cool us down. So there is a lot of stuff that we can do at the zoning level to help us improve our local climate. And in fact, that is something that we have a lot of control over. It might not always be the most politically popular thing, but I think that we can do a lot to protect our local climate faster and in a more beneficial way than if we were to focus on greenhouse gas emissions alone. And so that is where I think we should be putting a lot of our focus. So I hope that helps answer the question. Is the person who submitted that question with us today?
Let's see. That question was from Mary. I don't, yes, Mary has her hand raised. I'm going to let you talk, Mary.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear more from you if I did not fully answer that question there.
Okay. And the way you can unmute yourself, everyone, is if you mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see your audio controls. You'll see the microphone, and then that should allow you to talk. And Mary, I think you are ready to go.
Okay, I'm here, and I believe you did answer my question very well. Got some great ideas. I think that I would love to, is this presentation going to be recorded? Because I would love to share it with some of my members. Indicator was where we are. And I don't know, does anyone else have any follow-up questions? Some of my workmates are here from the Wild Center. I just got a notice that they're on.
Well, I'm glad I was able to answer the question. I just want to make sure it was meeting all your needs.
It is. I guess I do have one question, and that is, how do, when you, I'm assuming that you guys study individual sites in your work for municipalities, and what are the what are the names of some of the analyses that you do? I know you measure the ground level heat. What are some of the terms that you would use to describe what's going on, especially where it impacts humans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We talk about heat in so many different ways, and one of the ways that is broadly available, it's accessible for people to analyze urban heat islands is land surface temperature, LST.
Okay.
And that is great. It's from remote sensing, it comes from satellite data. And so you can get those kind of snapshots really routinely. Anytime that those satellites fly over, you can get something like Landsat. I'm a big fan of MODIS, M-O-D-I-S. You can get some 8-day average LST. That gives you kind of a good sense of just kind of on average, what does that land surface temperature feel like, getting that kind of average. And that's publicly available. Anybody can get that data. The only problem is we're not lying on the ground all the time. And so it is not directly applicable to the types of temperatures that we experience. And so what you really want to look out for is air temperature. So that's the temperature that we have. A lot of studies that you find are going to talk about urban heat islands using LST. And that gets very extreme, as I showed here. So for example, right here on this slide, putting a cool roof on your building can cool down that surface temperature over 100 degrees. And so when we're talking about urban heat islands from air temperature, you're not going to see differences of 100 degrees. But they can be really significant. The highest that I've ever seen is in New York City, where they have found air temperature differences just inside and outside the city of up to 27 degrees because of the urban heat island in that city. So you want to look for air temperature. The other thing you might want to look out for is, we call it thermal comfort, which are indices like, so that takes both temperature and humidity into account. That is where you start getting more into the human health side. So you can have a very, very hot day, but if it's a dry heat, it's not going to be as bad as if it is a very hot and humid day, because that humidity is going to make it harder for your body to cool down. You can sweat all you like, but if that sweat is not evaporating, you are not cooling down. So the high humidity is going to push up that heat index, and that becomes a major health risk. So you want to look into things like heat index. There are other thermal comfort indices. I can send you some more. There's some great papers that I'm aware of that kind of run through all of them. Some of them are difficult to derive because you might want to do things like wind speed, which we don't always have access to. There's one that is based on, it's called predictive mean vote, that, as I understand it, is based on how much people would complain about whether it is too hot or cold, and more for interior spaces. And that's, I believe, like a -3 to +3 kind of scale. Anyway, these are kind of indices that you can use. The types of terms I might encourage you to look into. We do our studies in a variety of ways at the Urban Climate Lab. We use regional climate models. So we ran, we wrote the first 2 heat management plans in the country. We did one for Dallas and one for Louisville. And in those studies, we used a regional climate model. So that might be sort of a gridded model. These are known as downscale climate models. Sometimes dynamically downscaled climate models. When you see global climate projections, that's usually, it's a climate model, but it is not downscaled. It is a very coarse resolution. And then people use downscaled climate models to talk more on the city scale. So when you downscale a climate model, you're going to start to see variations in the urban heat island as a result of that. So the dynamically downscaled climate models are going to give you these kinds of urban heat island measurements that we use in our studies. You can use these models to also run scenarios. So you can do things like, what if a majority of the city had white roofs? Well, if you implement that strategy, you see far, far cooler temperatures. You might say, what happens if we plant a lot of trees? You're going to see cooler temperatures. So that's the kind of model that we use on a citywide scale. We also use field measurements. So we have a project that we call the Georgia Tech Climate Network that had, it has since been completed, so these have all been taken down. But we had temperature sensors. This was, again, temperature and humidity and air temperature and humidity sensors all over Georgia Tech's campus and around the Atlanta metro area. And that is where we can get some maps like this. So we can actually find the urban heat island of, say, Georgia Tech's campus. And so this is not based on a model. This is based on actual field measurements. So from this kind of study, we can see that on Georgia Tech's campus alone, you might have an urban heat island intensity up to 7 degrees, just based on what your environment looks like. Say a very heavily paved area versus some of our greener areas. Some of the greener areas look more like our vegetated pathways on campus. We found that our very low vegetation areas will exceed 91 degrees Fahrenheit over the 92 days of summer 53 times, versus our areas that had higher vegetation exceeded them only 7 times. So this is one way that you can consider what that local climate change really looks like, that people who live in areas that look like this experience a fundamentally different summer than people who live in areas that look like this. So we use air temperature sensors for that. There's a few networks that are similar to it. For whatever reason, these sensors are called HOBOs. H-O-B-O. Does not actually stand for anything. But if you look up HOBO studies, you might find a few cities that you can look to. Or I'm happy to tell you more about the Georgia Tech Climate Network, say if you're interested in doing something like this for Decatur. So that is a kind of broad overview of some of the terminology that we use. And I am happy to talk more about that if people are interested.
Thank you.
We actually have another question coming in from Alexandria, so you can unmute yourself and go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and what a great presentation. Following up on Mary's question, do you happen to know of any incentives for homeowners to implement green infrastructure on their properties, other than, you know, their peace of mind, that they're doing something good? And more broadly, do you have any recommendations for individuals in Atlanta that can help increase our coping range, other than, you know, of course, volunteering with Trees Atlanta to go plant some trees? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So the incentives are unfortunately disappearing. The incentives are very, very sensitive to our higher administrations, our statewide government and our national government. So we used to have many more incentives than we do now. Those were things like tax credits to increase your insulation. We do currently have a kind of an incentive that's the stormwater incentive. So you are actually required to manage a volume of stormwater that is similar to the pre-development level. So the developers have an incentive when they are developing to build stormwater management design strategies, say, to be managing their stormwater. We are not quite so progressive as some other cities that have a direct monetary benefit. There are some cities, this is another term to look up and support as much as you can in Atlanta, called stormwater utility. There are some cities that say, we will cut your property taxes if you manage more of your stormwater on site. So it's kind of a carrot or stick approach. They can either cut your taxes or give you just a direct benefit, or fine the people who don't do that kind of thing. There's a couple different designs that you can use for that. But that is something I would love to see in Atlanta. We have major stormwater runoff issues. And so that would be a direct incentive. The other direct incentive that I would say just comes across in your utility bills. So you can significantly reduce the amount of energy you spend on air conditioning by having what we call overstory canopy. So shading your home. And so there are studies out there, I'm happy to share them if you send me an email, that have analyzed just how much of a percentage you can save based on a percentage of tree coverage, say. And so you will be paying significantly less on your utility bills by planting those trees around your home and by planting them in a certain orientation that really helps you shade during the summer. There are lots of studies out there. I will share this study all day, every day. It is on the New York City Collective Urban Forest. And they did a cost-benefit analysis of their urban forest. And they found that for every dollar you put into maintaining and planting a tree canopy, a healthy urban canopy, you get $5.6 back in all the benefits that you get. So that is benefits like the energy reduction that I just mentioned, shading those buildings, CO2 capture, of course, air quality, stormwater management, and then aesthetic other, that refers to increase in property values. Study after study after study finds that by planting those trees, you are going to increase your property values by being more vegetated. And so these are not so much incentives in the sense of, say, a tax break or like a grant or a subsidy, but more of benefits that you will just see kind of in your everyday life. So when you go to sell that house, or just in the monthly payments that you pay on your power, you're going to see those go down if you have more green infrastructure around your home. And you don't even necessarily have to have it shading your home directly. Just by having more vegetation around your home, you're going to be reducing all of those drivers of the local climate. That local climate can be very local. It can be your neighborhood. It can be your plot of land. And so by helping to cool that down with more vegetation, you're going to cool down your interior temperatures, which for Atlanta is going to directly lead to savings for you. I also mentioned, let me see if I can find it. There we go. Louisville is taking this very seriously based on the study that we did for them. So they do actually have direct monetary benefits. So if you, I believe it currently only applies to commercial right now, but they're hoping to expand it, that they will match you dollar for dollar in tree planting. If you plant some trees, they're going to help you plant some more trees. Called the Green Heart Project. But then you as a homeowner, this is residential, they have the Cool 502 project, which is, oh, have I not been visible this whole time?
No, you've been visible.
Okay, I'm just seeing myself. The Cool 502 project, that is a program. That is another, again, dollar for dollar match. If you put money into building a new roof, you want to change out your roof, you got to do that every now and then anyway. You make it a cool roof, they're going to help you pay for that. And they might pay for up to half of that because it is a white roof and because that's going to help cool down local temperatures. So when we talk about these kinds of policies that we should advocate for in a place like Atlanta, these are very much things that we should advocate for. They do cost the city money because of these kind of direct payments, but these are for the collective good. If we have enough of the city doing things like that vegetation, like these cool roofs, that will, long story short, save lives, because we know that it's going to reduce the amount of extreme heat that people are exposed to. It will also save the city a lot of money. You're going to be paying less in all of those utilities, because air conditioning is something we do a lot of here in Atlanta. And so if we do this on a large enough scale, we will be significantly advancing our climate adaptation. It's going to enhance our resilience. It's going to enhance our coping capacity. And so that is going to have a major, major benefit to the entire city. So this is the kind of thing that we should be pushing for. Now, in terms of what can we do as citizens, I have just at the end here, I was going to show this at the end, but I'll show it now. You should absolutely be following Trees Atlanta to keep up with the Atlanta Tree Protection Ordinance. We should be pushing in any way that we can to have a more robust tree protection ordinance. And right here, go to your NPU meetings. Atlanta, we have a lot of power as residents in this city, in that ideally, not always, but ideally 1/3 of every planning decision or every new development or redevelopment goes to an NPU vote. The NPU vote has 1/3 of the weight in the final decision. And so whenever anything like this is coming up, or you want to push for something like this, that comes up to your NPU meeting. That is your neighborhood planning unit. Go to those meetings. It is all the easier now because they are all online. They're all Zoom meetings now. So if you didn't want to go to that local community center, you can just hop on Zoom and you can get into these meetings. You hold a lot of power comparatively in Atlanta that nobody uses. They're not popular to go to, not many people go to them, and you lose your say if you're not participating in that. So go to those NPU meetings. This is where we should be pushing for some of these kinds of initiatives. So that's sort of the power that we have. You always have the power to talk about this kind of stuff. If you say have a like a neighborhood association, go to those meetings, find out when they happen, and push for this kind of thing. See what you can get together and accomplish, even in your neighborhood. Because as I said, the local climate can be a very local climate. One neighborhood could be entirely different from the neighboring neighborhood, just based on what you choose to do in that neighborhood. So you have a lot of power over how you personally feel every day, how you feel in that climate. So anyway, those are my my get up and go kind of tips for what we should be doing.
Awesome. We have a question in the chat, and then we have another hand raised. So the chat question says, what does the science suggest Atlanta will experience of global warming in 2030 and 2050?
That is kind of up to us. So the projections that we have, go back to these, projections that we have for the Southeast by the mid-century are only about 4 to 5 degrees on average warming. Now I say only, but that is average. That can mean a very, very big difference on any given day. Because remember, climate is not weather. The everyday weather that you actually experience could be significantly warmer than on any given day. By the end of the century, that's where we're starting to look more towards about 7 degrees. These models, in something like the National Climate Assessment or the IPCC, they are not necessarily factoring cities into this. And so we have seen, go to a different slide now, when we monitor the urban heat island on a broad scale, this is from a study that the Climate Lab did a few years back. So this is kind of an average of rural weather stations across the United States. This has been the past 50 years. When we bring in, so right away, of course, we're seeing an increase in temperature. This is climate change. This is global atmospheric climate change that we're seeing. When we see urban stations, this is weather stations that are very close to urban areas, right away, you see about 1.5 degrees warmer. This just shift entirely up. So when we talk about those averages, getting up to 7 degrees warmer by the end of the century, we are not taking into account in that kind of analysis how much warmer we might be in the cities just by the fact of us being in the city. So we know right away it's going to be a lot warmer if we continue to develop the way that we do. We also notice that the rate of warming in these cities is higher than the rate of warming we see in the global atmospheric climate change. And that is because of the way that we're developing. This is the trend that we have where we are tearing down trees and we are putting up parking lots. And that kind of expansion of the urban heat island is making us warm even faster. And so when we compare all of our hottest or most quickly warming cities, we are at number 3 in the country. We are warming very, very quickly. In fact, when we look at cities with a growing urban heat island, that is us included, we see roughly a 100% amplification in the rate of warming. So we are warming twice as fast as nearby rural areas. And so that's why I say that these projections are up to us, because if we choose to keep developing the way that we do, then I would argue that those estimates by the end of the century of up to 7 to 8 degrees warming on average are low estimates, because that is regional. If we dig into the city and we continue to develop the way that we do, it's going to be higher than that. But if we really get our act together and we start really focusing on local adaptation efforts, then I would argue that in the city, you're going to see lower temperatures, because we're going to have the kind of vegetation, we're going to have the kind of evapotranspirative cooling that not only helps to mitigate climate change, that reduces emissions, that helps us avoid this kind of higher emissions scenario, helps us adapt to climate change. And you're going to see the kinds of temperature differences that you have on a scale like we saw in the Tech Climate Network, like this. We could have some neighborhoods that look a whole lot like this, be a whole lot cooler than the neighborhoods that look a whole lot like this, that are just very, very impervious surface covered, not a lot of vegetation, and are going to warm up as a result. So that is up to us. So the projections for what we will actually feel is going to depend on what we do in the meantime to improve the climate resilience of this city. So that's a very vague answer, but it's really what we're up against.
Thank you. All right, we have another question from Arjit. Arjit, you can go ahead and then, there you go. Awesome.
Okay, so Evan, your research is really valuable, and the Urban Climate Lab, it's doing awesome work. And it's so good that it is in Atlanta, because this city really needs help. You know, there is runaway development going on here. So my question is more towards policy, and I'm wondering how your research and research of the Urban Climate Lab, how is it being considered or applied by the city of Atlanta and Brookhaven and all the other cities that are in this area when they make zoning and greening decisions? Because it seems to me that they don't pay any attention to anything. You know, like in Brookhaven in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's going to go on for the next 6 years, they are building huge hospitals and stadiums and whatnot, new hotels on Briarcliff Road and North Druid Hills Road. And it doesn't look like they have considered any greening or zoning, nothing. So my question is really, do you have a seat at the table with these, you know, zoning officials? Do you have a dialogue with them regularly? Do you let them know what your research is showing? Or I know I'm a researcher myself. I know how researchers kind of like to stay out of the political arena. You know, they don't want to be looked as polarized this way or that way. So they just do the research and publish their data.
Yeah.
But how can we make this change, any real change, and make it fast enough? You know, because developers are just covering every inch of space in and around the city. So and how, as not only you as citizens, what can we do other than really greening our homes that you were, you know, referring to earlier? But now that these properties are already planned and some of them have already been erected, how can we go and make any changes around those? I mean, it's very frustrating what's going on. So
It is. It is. So I wish I could say that I did have a seat at the table. I wish I could say that I'm regularly working together, collaborating directly with them, but we are not. We're kind of a special group in that the Urban Climate Lab is based in the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech. And planners are advocates. Good planners are advocates. We are doing everything we can to reach out to try and get this data to cities, try and get our policy recommendations directly to cities who we think will implement them. The Urban Climate Lab has unfortunately really only been successful directly in Louisville. So after writing that plan for them, they made a lot of big policy changes that are going to see major improvements. We are reaching out all the time to the city to say, hey, we have some really useful data that we think is going to really help with your decision making. But unfortunately, it has not always been met with open arms and open ears. And it's partially due to so much of the development in Atlanta being driven by the developers. And so one of the arguments that I try to make is that there is a top-down and a bottom-up approach to anything policy and planning related. You can have this kind of heavy hand of the government enforcing certain protection ordinances, things like that. That is not always, it has a high level of assurance that it might actually do something because everybody has to follow it by law. But you don't always have the flexibility with it to make sure that it's really as intense as it needs to be to see the kind of changes that we need to have. So Atlanta right now is going through a rewrite of its tree protection ordinance, but it is a very difficult, highly politicized kind of battle. And we're not necessarily seeing the kind of change that we need to see. We're not seeing this tree protection ordinance move in the direction that we need it to move. And so folks like Trees Atlanta are really fighting the good fight. They're trying to advocate for the kind of protection that we need to see. I have personally pitched the city of Atlanta on the kinds of improvements that I know we need to have in this city for the tree protection ordinance. And fortunately, there were a few interested people. We've had some conversations from there. But largely, you're right that most folks in my position, particularly climatologists or urban climatologists, meteorologists, don't really work in the kind of policy advocacy that we need. And so that is where I hope that this information reaches every one of you who do have the power to advocate for this kind of thing by advocating for a stronger tree protection ordinance, by attending these kinds of meetings. Anytime I give a public presentation like this, people always ask me, what can I do? And the number one thing that I tell you is to get as involved as possible in these kinds of political processes. Depending on how much time I have to answer that, I'll give more detail about things like going to NPU meetings, going to any of these kinds of public hearings on these kinds of things. If I don't have a lot of time, then I will say vote. One of the biggest things that we can try and do is vote in every election, all the way top to the bottom, to get the kinds of leadership that we need to introduce this kind of legislation. Because if you have someone at the top who's really pushing and fighting for this kind of stuff, you're going to see more bills, you're going to see more votes on that kind of thing. You're going to see these come to your NPU meetings more often. The ground up solution I think, is to focus as hard as you can on what we call the co-benefits of these kinds of strategies that we know we need to have in order to adapt to a changing climate. That is things like this table that I showed you, the benefits of the urban forest, where if you present it this way as a cost-benefit analysis, which is kind of speaking the language of money, which a lot of people speak, you see that for every dollar you put in, you get 5.6 back by promoting a healthy, vibrant urban canopy, urban forest. And so these kinds of co-benefits that you can get, you don't even have to call it climate adaptation. You can just call it smart economics, and people will pay attention to that. You never have to call any of these things climate adaptation. You have to bring up climate once for these ideas to sound really good if you talk about it in the right way. We have study after study that are showing that the net benefit for trees in all of these various co-benefits, property value alone, you can argue for, but stormwater, air quality, energy, you're gonna see this net benefit for coming up. If you want to talk about it in local terms, we can point to things like combined sewer systems. If you say we need to separate our combined sewer system, where if we have more stormwater runoff than our sewer system can manage, we get sewage that gets pumped out directly at overflow into our waterways. To make it less abstract, you can point directly to our local waterways. This is Tanyard Creek Park. It is a beautiful, beautiful park. I used to take my dog there all the time when I lived close to it. Those dogs could not keep themselves from swimming in that creek. And it was the most disgusting thing because very frequently we would have combined sewer overflows. I bet you might be able to guess what this is. This is toilet paper. It is coming directly from our sewers and coming straight out into our waterways. That's why we have these signs that say don't do that. If you want to see less of this, you want to have safer environments for your dogs, for your children, for yourself, you will plant more trees. You will have these kinds of benefits going on in your city. It is just the smart thing to do to have this kind of stuff if you argue for it in the right way. And you should argue for it at every level that you can, from the very top of the government down to your neighborhood association. If you live in a building that has an association, like a larger residential building, you should be talking about this. You should be talking about this with your family. That is just the smart thing to do in so many different ways. So that, I think arguing for the co-benefits is one of the best things that we can be doing. And that's why I will take any opportunity I can to talk with folks like all of you on a Friday evening so that you can go out and tell everyone you know about this kind of stuff.
And I think we have 2 more questions, but they're very similar. So if I don't get this totally correct, if you submitted these 2 questions, let me know and I can clarify. And then after that, we'll probably wrap up. It's about 8:13 right now. So this question is, how has less cars on the road since March, basically because of the lockdowns with COVID, affected Atlanta compared to prior years? So how has that reduction of CO2 affected the climate, or have you seen anything significant because of what happened with the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. So that is a fantastic question. So I am actually, I'm a naturally optimistic person, but I think that we're going to have actually significant measurable differences in some of our environmental outcomes as a result of the pandemic. So I have not seen any studies that come directly from Atlanta, but I have seen studies from around the world, mostly Italy and China. If you look these up, you can see measurable air quality benefits from the lockdowns. So you can actually see just before, just after, you can compare year to year, same time of year, that there have been significant measurable decreases in the amount of air pollutants that come from all of the shutdowns that we've had around the world. Now, just to show you kind of how sensitive our atmosphere is, you can also see in those very same studies or articles online how quickly it comes back. So you can see, you know, a day that is shut down, and then the next day it is open again, and all of that air pollution comes right back. So that has a major, major impact. And so the lower amount of driving that we've been doing, I have not seen for Atlanta what that has done for air quality, let alone for greenhouse gas emissions. But there is a great study that you can find when the Olympics were hosted here. We shut down a lot of streets and we had a lot of more buses than we used to. So it was not a pandemic, but it was a major, major event that really affected the traffic around the city. And there are studies that have shown that there were significant reductions in air pollutants as a result of that, by just having more buses instead of more cars. And as a result of having lower air pollutant emissions, we actually had measurably fewer asthma attacks in the city because of that. So if you want to see the impact of having the lower driving, I urge you to check out that study or articles about it because it's very similar. Now, one of the things that I think is going to be very interesting to watch from a planning perspective, from a climate change perspective, from just an air quality perspective, is the difference in prevalence of telecommuting pre and post pandemic. I mean, once this is completely over, we have a vaccine, we don't worry at all about it anymore. How many people are going to be more likely to request working from home? How many people are going to be more likely to grant requests working from home? As we see that this actually can work out in a lot of cases. There have been a lot of studies that show, don't quote me on this, but I think it was about 84% of at least white collar jobs could be done entirely remotely. Those people do not need to be driving across the entire metro Atlanta region anymore. Now, of course, that's not everybody, but we will have a measurable difference in the amount of people who are doing that kind of driving, and that will have a major impact on both the air quality, the waste heat, and the greenhouse gas emissions as a result. The pandemic actually has a major, major impact on all of that.
I think that actually tied into, Robert, your question about corporate decisions and employees' ability to work from home. That kind of answers that. If there are not any other questions, then we will go ahead and wrap up.
Okay.
I don't see any. Okay.
So before we do, I just wanted to point out some additional resources I urge everybody to check out. These are the kind of the ways that I, as a climate change researcher, stay in the know. So there is a wonderful urban heat island compendium that is put together by the EPA. So just Google, these are things to Google later or tonight if you are interested. They have just one of the better collections that I have seen of what is the urban heat island, what causes it, and what can we do about it. Wonderful figures, wonderful illustrations, wonderful graphs, and then they also have a newsletter that just every now and then will send you in your email. Just here's the very latest information. They have webinars you can join, kind of like this one. That is really the cutting edge of this kind of work. Is going to come through that. So I urge you to sign up for that. I really urge you to check out the National Climate Assessment, also known as the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the USGCRP. The IPCC is great, but the IPCC is also thousands of pages long. It's very technical. The National Climate Assessment breaks down the climate impacts by type. So like by precipitation, by heat, by health impacts, by economic impact, and it breaks it down by region. So you can actually read specifically about the Southeast. What is climate change going to mean for us? And it is one of the best collections of how you can really localize that information. There is a group called the Security and Sustainability Forum. That is a group that you can also sign up for, similar to this newsletter from the EPA, where they have things like these webinars. That is, again, the kind of cutting edge of what is going on with that. I urge you all to check out the Climate Reality Project, the Atlanta chapter. I have not been able to join it in a very long time, but they're a very cool group that does work specifically around climate change in Atlanta, specifically. And it has wonderful leadership and is a wonderful community. So I urge you to check that out, join it to stay related, or stay in the know with all of that. Please do follow Trees Atlanta. Go to all their events. Keep up with the Atlanta Tree Ordinance and the rewrite, and go to your MPU meetings, please. If you want to talk to me, feel free to email anytime. I'm happy to talk with you or send you any resources that you might be interested in. So my email address is there. You can go to our website, urbanclimate.caltech.edu. And thank you again so much for joining me on this lovely Friday evening to talk about climate change. And I'm so thrilled that all of you joined us tonight. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Evan. And thank you everyone else for attending this wonderful Ask the Expert. We will be doing a lot more of these as we go into the year. And as always, if you have questions, you're welcome to email us at education@treesatlanta.org, or you can always find our events at treesatlanta.org/calendar. You guys have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.